Participles, the adjective form of the verb, are very important in Latin. Very important. Whereas in English we love our subordinate clauses, Latin loves its participles. So this makes learning about participles a little rough for an English speaker. It's a bit of complex grammar and not something that's easily relatable. I'm going to talk about the perfect passive participle, how Latin forms it from verbs, and how it is used. First off, participles are verbal adjectives. And what does this mean? Well, most importantly, it means that participles are adjectives first and foremost, and so, because of this, participles always describe nouns. So a participle will have the same case, number, and gender as the noun it describes, but it has the verbal component, and that's because participles originate from verbs. So in this English example, the student, praised by his teacher, was learning Latin. The word praised is our participle. It comes from the verb to praise, but really it's acting as an adjective describing the boy. And in Latin, praised would be construed as a perfect passive participle, laudatus. Okay, so to form the perfect passive participle, we always look at the verb's fourth principal part. Verbs have principal parts that we use to make all forms of the verb, and learn more from my principal part video here. Not all verbs have four principal parts, but when one does, that one is the perfect passive participle. And sometimes the fourth part is listed in instead of us, which means it's the accusative supine. Change the ending to an us, and you get the perfect passive participle when it exists. This us ending shows us that perfect passive participles are first and second declension adjectives. That means they have endings from the first and second declension only. Here's the masculine singular, and these are second declension endings, the feminine singular, first declension endings, and the neuter singular, again with the second declension, this time neuter endings. The plural, of course, uses the plural first and second declension endings. So I said before that you can translate perfect passive participles with having been, like having been praised or having been wounded, or just even the ed form of the word, like praised or wounded. So here, dux ab hoste vulnerātus ad urbem revēnit. The leader, having been wounded by the enemy, or you could just say wounded by the enemy, returned to the city. The having been wounded describes the dux, the leader. It's an adjective, but it's also showing an action that has happened already, and that action happened to the leader rather than him doing the action. And so that's the whole point of the term perfect passive participle. The perfect shows a completed action, already done at a time before the action of the sentence. The passive shows that the noun it's describing is receiving the action rather than doing it. Who's doing the action? Here, it's the enemy, hoste. From Virgil, Neptūnus graviter commotus, hiemem sensit. Neptune, having been greatly disturbed, or just greatly disturbed, sensed the storm. And commotus is our perfect passive participle, describing Neptune. Because the perfect passive participle shows time before action, we can translate it into English with a clause introduced by after, or when, or even since. When Cicero is talking about the defeat of the revolutionary Catiline in his second Catilinarian oration, he says, Jacet ille nunc prostratus. Now he lies there, having been overthrown. We could say he is lying on the ground now after he has been overthrown, or since he's been overthrown. With this, there's both the idea that Catiline has already been defeated, or literally strewn on the ground. That's the prostratus, and is actually lying on the ground, having recently died in battle. Virgil's famous beginning of the Aeneid, I sing of arms and the man who first came to Italy, also includes the participle iactatus in the phrase multilateris iactatus adulto. He, having been tossed about much both on land and on the sea, but you could say after he had been tossed, because Aeneas's toils on land and sea happened before he came to Italy. One other thing, you'll often find a perfect passive participle in a sentence with an ablative of agent or an ablative of means, and this identifies who or what is doing the action. Here's the simple rule on this. When the doer is a person, we use the preposition ab or a plus the ablative, and it's an ablative of agent. So let's return to our earlier sentence. Dux ad hoste vulnerātus ad urbem revēnit. Ab hoste, by the enemy. We use ab here because enemy is a person. And so this is an ablative of agent. And by the way, when do we use ab and when a? It comes down to the beginning of the next word. When this ablative starts with a vowel or an H, the B is necessary to make sure those two vowels don't run into each other. When the ablative noun starts with a consonant, the B is superfluous, and so it goes away. It's kind of like the difference between an or a in English. When the doer is an object, not a person, we do not use the ab or a plus the ablative, but just a simple ablative without a preposition. We can change our sentence from ab hoste, by the enemy, to gladio, by the sword. But now, since sword is not a person, but an object, we don't use the preposition, and it becomes an ablative of means. Wounded by the sword, by means of the sword. Same thing. So those are perfect passive participles. A quick review. Participles in general are verbal adjectives. They come from verbs, but in truth describe nouns, and so they really are adjectives. The perfect passive participle shows an action happening at some point of time before the action in the rest of the sentence, and the noun described by the participle is receiving the action. We find perfect passive participles by looking at the verb's fourth principal part. You'll notice, by the way, that the perfect passive participle often ends in a tus, or less frequently a sus or something similar. That's a real pattern. We translate perfect passive participles in English with a having been, followed by the ed form of the verb, or even without this having been, but with just that ed form of the verb. And there are irregular exceptions in English that do exist. Finally, the perfect passive participle will often, but not always, be accompanied by an ablative that shows who or what is doing the action, either an ablative of means if the doer is an object, or an ablative of agent with the preposition ab or a if the doer is a person. Speaking of ablatives of agent, perfect passive participles are like James Bond's martinis, shaken, not stirred. Well, shaken and stirred, because both of those are perfect passive participles.